Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Comic Source. I'm your host, Jace, here to talk today about a series. It's had 4 volumes. I've read all 4. They're really interesting, lots of history and literature, what have you. They're available from Scout Comics. The title is called Shepherd, and I have the 2 co-writers and co-creators of this property joining me, Andrea Molinari and his son, Roberto Molinari. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure meeting with us.
Yeah, so I guess we should start off. It's such an interesting origin, if you will, where the impetus of the first idea. So we'll start with you, Andrea. And you talk about this in the foreword for the first book. Give our audience a sense. Where did this idea come from? How did it start?
Well, it was a nightmare. I feel like I've told this story so many times. I would feel, obviously it's a new audience, new people, but essentially I had this terrible nightmare about Roberto. In my nightmare, I dreamed that he had passed away from a drug overdose. And what was particularly marked, there's a couple of things that marked that nightmare. Number one is that when I woke up, it stayed with me as if somebody had branded it into my mind and in my heart, probably because of how intense it was. And then the second part about it, as to the intensity, was that not only did I dream that that happened, but I dreamed it in incredible detail where, I'm at the morgue identifying the body, I'm at the funeral home, I'm at the grave site, I'm months later still not over trying to cope with the loss and trying to understand it and all those things. And so I woke up at the end of it and, was really jarred, sweating, shaking, breathing heavy. My wife was next to me. Obviously, she was very concerned and, I jokingly say that, she said, well, what's going on? I said, I don't think you want to know. And she's like, well, now I kind of do. I need to know.
Yeah.
When I told her, her response was, I hate you, And I was like, but you asked, you wanted me to tell you, and I tell you, and now you hate me. And, but I was, laughing about it, of course, now, but it was not funny. It was not funny at all. In fact, it took me a couple of days, really, to get up enough nerve to be able to talk to Roberto about it. And of course, in true Roberto,
it wasn't something that I was worried about. Like, I make a joke pretty much every time that we talk about this, that like, since in the dream I died of a meth overdose, and at the time I didn't have a meth problem, really wasn't worried about it.
Yeah, I don't blame you. That I would be the exact same way. I'm like, well, that's not how I'm going to go. I've never used drugs, never will, so I'm safe. But this idea to turn the story, not even to just tell a story, but specifically to make it into a comic. So I'm curious, Roberto, were you a comic book reader? Was that something, when your dad was telling you about the story, you're like, oh, well, if we want to tell the story, I think comics would be the perfect medium.
Yeah. So Dad and the thing is, like, he got me into comics is like, I was, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years old, potentially even younger. Like, I was reading comic books from like a really early age because Dad wanted to get me reading just in some way. And then that was the way that kind of stuck, just because at the time, like, I thought it was like really, really cool. Like, and then in high school, like, I was still at it. I was like, I think reading probably a lot of Hellboy at the time. And then I think I was also reading like the Robin series. But, when he told me about that, I was like, okay, well, yeah, let's do a comic book, which I had no idea what we were getting into. I had no idea like the work that goes into it at the time or anything else. But like, I was just like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. And that's what's so interesting to me, because as we said, everybody, there's 4 collected volumes. The first one gets into the origin, and we'll do a little bit of the elevator pitch here in a second. But then the second one kind of explores the world that of the seam, as it's called, and sort of get into the world that Lawrence and Val, to the main characters, the father and son, sort of inhabit. And then the third one is interesting because your daughter co-writes it with you, Andrea, which is really awesome. But again, it shows, I think, the potential for stories in this world and how you can tell so many different ones. And then the last one, which is probably my favorite, which Roberto was the lead writer on, which is this romance, and it really adds a lot of context to Val, the son, who I'm sure Roberto, you identify with in so many ways other than the drug problem, which is so interesting. But I think the fourth one might be the most relatable because, as you know, Andrea, being a father and that, like you said, the hell of it, right? Losing a son. I can relate to that. I have children, but not everybody does, and especially when it's a father-son relationship, which is different than a father-daughter relationship. You have both, I have both, so we understand that, but not everybody does. But a little more universal idea that's a little more relatable, I think, for everybody is like falling in love, especially that first love and that romance story, which is fantastic. So we'll get a little more into detail, everybody, on the volume 4, which gets into that. But I do want to throw it back over to you, Andrea, and give everybody a sense of the idea. So you talked about getting that original idea, but then you go to tell a story of loss and sort of obsession of not being willing to let go of a loved one. So give everybody sort of a real quick origin of the shepherd who is basically Lawrence, the father, who goes after his son who's been lost to him.
Well, I think, probably, banging around in my head was some of the losses that our family had taken in a couple years previous to this. My own father passed away through bone marrow cancer in, I want to say 2005. And then a couple years previous, my mother-in-law, with whom I was very close, passed away in a car accident. My dad and I were very close, and he's actually reflected. He's a character in the book, Franco. And in a way, I think that this is a way of coping with loss, coping with dealing with that loss, and coming to realize that when we lose somebody that we love, in a lot of ways, it's like we never get over it. We just learn to walk with that limp. We learn to live with the absence. And so I think that that's a big part of it. Certainly that origin story, volume 1, very much reflects the dream very powerfully. Beryl and I talked about it. Probably the two areas that we took liberties with, in terms of changing from what the dream was like, was the actual appearance of what Legio looks like, which she takes the form of a wolf. That was not the case in the dream. Beryl and I talked about this. In the dream, he was a creature in the shadow, always in the shadow. And you never got a good look at him. It was like something you saw only through the corner of your eye. Mm-hmm. You knew it was terrible. You knew it was fearsome and deadly, but you never got a look at it. It never fully emerged from the shadows, but what you did see scared the ever-loving hell out of you. And so that was the physical form, having to give it a physical form. And then the other one was the actual staff, because in the dream it came out of me. It was like the power came out of me. But for the book purposes, we needed something to kind of concretize that power that he wielded, that I wielded in the dream. So those were the two things that we spent a long time talking about. Remember that, Beryl? That was quite some discussions about how that would go, that type of thing. But that origin story very much reflects that search, the man's loss of his son, the decision to go after his son into the afterlife because of that sense that something was wrong, that something hadn't gone the way it should have gone, and that he didn't pass on the way that he should have, that he was somehow trapped in the between, which is really what the seam is. The seam is the in-between this life and whatever comes next. And him sensing that and then choosing to go after his son and then searching for his son, but not really being able to find his son. And so therefore kind of his mission kind of gets redirected into anger and vengeance, going after the people that hurt his son. So that's kind of how that story and the origin story works out.
Yeah, and it's very powerful, everybody, really cool. And then, like I said, the second volume really kind of explores the idea of the seam and what it can be and how it's different for different people, sort of based on what their life experiences is, how how they died, any guilt or trauma that's keeping them from passing. Because as Andreas said, it's the afterlife, but it's sort of the way station before you get to your final destination, right? Like think of it as the so often the cliche of Ghost, right? Like why do you stay? Because you have something that's unresolved. So think of the people, the souls in the seam. They sort of have something unresolved. And so that's, the second volume really deals with that and shows what can happen. And then, like I said, that third volume, again, bringing in the younger kids, the younger son and daughter that are still alive, and how they can see Val and how they can see Lawrence, and they're really cool and emotional stories. But then getting to that final volume, which is my favorite, which is so interesting. So I want to ask you, Roberto, we're talk about it as a love story, and we talk about the seam as kind of this holding place, and maybe if somebody's hasn't completely passed on, but they're near death, they might show up there and have an opportunity to maybe return to life, maybe not, and what have you. But the idea of exploring the seam and using it as almost this metaphor for coming of age, right? Because you mentioned this being kind of a first love story for Val and the girl that he partners up with. This idea of sort of discovering who you are, and the way the seam is sort of malleable, and how that sort of compares and contrasts with this idea of coming of age. You're at that age, you're not sure who you're going to end up with, in love, who you're going to be in life, what your identity is going to be, and that sort of thing. So, are those things that interest you, that you really like to explore? I mean, the whole idea of Shepherd is, it's been a big part of your life when you were so much younger. So I think you come at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like, even since writing that, like, ideas that I've had about that topic have kind of changed. But we really wanted to spend a lot of time on Val in The Tether. Like, that was basically like the big thing. We did want to write a romance, and then it kind of came out of something else that I had written previously. Like, Dad and I were actually like taking a look at it again recently. But I wrote in college a short story called Library, or The Library, if I can spit it out. And in this short story, which I wrote for things like a screenwriting class or something like that, it was from the point of view of students who were in a library on a college setting, that were basically experiencing a mass shooting kind of situation. And like, that was like, that particular short story was all about kind of like the fear, the uncertainty, the tension, trying to get away and all that. But that was kind of like actually the birthplace of The Tether. And then that got kind of like tied to Val. When we started fleshing out where The Tether was going to go, like what characters were going to do what pieces were going to go where. But that's where it started. It wasn't even really necessarily like the romance thing. Kind of like was a later idea, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me. So you mentioned wanting to explore Val, and before we started recording, Andrew, you were talking about this idea of, Val had some experiences because he passed much. A period of time went by before Lawrence, did what he did and followed Val into the afterlife. So there was a period of time when Val was there, and to go back to what I was saying about identity, he didn't necessarily know who he was. It takes a while in the scene to remember and that sort of thing. So what was it specifically, Roberto, that when you say you wanted to explore Val and explore some of these ideas, was it just that you thought it was a good fertile ground for story, or did you think Val still needed to be fleshed out as a character, or was it about he died when he's young, he still has some growing up to do?
Yeah, so this is like a little column A, column B, and column C. Like, I think definitely on that last point, like, it was about, the character chewing on the consequences of his actions, which I think is actually one of the things that makes him relatable, because we've all in our lives fucked up, and I realize I have no idea whether or not I have permission to say that, but we've all made mistakes. But we've all made mistakes, and sometimes those have serious consequences. And that's something that he's kind of dealing with heavily. We knew that we also wanted to kind of get into other things like world building. Like I've been reading fantasy stuff since forever. I've been reading, different worlds that people have kind of built from scratch. And one of the things that was always interesting to me is kind of like the mechanics of how things work. So not only do we want to get into the like character world building of like, for example, like we were talking about what happened to Val in the interim, because he dies significantly before his father does. So when we get into that, sorry, I'm a little fried. I've been up like since like really, really early this morning.
No,
but okay, sorry, I'm just gonna leave that to the side because I'm like actually like faded out here a little bit. Not, but regarding the world building stuff, which I got sidetracked off of, the mechanics of how things work is really important to me. So like when I was reading stuff like Harry Potter, the question is, why is this wizard more powerful? And I never really understood that because it's kind of implied that it's by blood, but it's also kind of a sense of like cowboyism. Like, is he just like fast on the draw? Is he really creative? Is that what makes him a powerful wizard? And I never felt like that got satisfactorily like answered. And then in other stuff like Lord of the Rings, the detail that like Tolkien put into his world building, why things are the way that they are, led to questions that we had about like, why didn't Val recognize his father when they meet? And that's kind of like a valid question for somebody that's going through the series. Why doesn't he know who he is? And so we kind of explore that a little bit in The Tether, like talking about what happens in these conflicts between souls.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that's so interesting. Again, you mentioned this idea that he was there by himself for a little while, or maybe a long while, before his father shows up. But again, almost to a point where when he passed away, he was a young man, and he wasn't, he didn't necessarily have the wisdom of age or of experience. But because of the nature of the scene and because of the trauma that he himself is bringing to it, it's almost like he's stagnated. Even though time had passed, he's in the form of this wolf, and he's not really allowing himself to grow. And it's very much, I think, Lawrence, his father, showing up, and he sort of regains that identity. And then even though he's not physically aging, because he's a ghost basically, there's still a sense that, okay, my father's here, my grandfather's here. Now I am getting experience. I mean, difficult teenage thing, right, where he's rebelling against their advice and needs to learn these lessons himself. But at least it presents an opportunity for him to grow. Were you cognizant of that sort of structure, or was that just sort of organically how we're talking about all 4 volumes here, the journey that he's gone on?
Yeah, so that's kind of almost been like intrinsic to our story from the beginning, whether or not it was conscious. The idea of people getting stuck in cycles is something that we have basically been doing from the beginning, because people do kind of get stuck in a rut, and then they never fix these issues until sometimes it just takes somebody coming along and pointing out to them like, hey, this thing that you're doing, like, you're hurting yourself. And like, you keep doing it because you don't recognize this behavior or this pattern that you're stuck in. And like, having somebody else show up can make all the difference. And that's kind of what the shepherd does, is he makes that difference. He kind of like breaks people out of their cycles.
So let's talk a little bit, Andrea, about the theme of family, which is probably the biggest overriding theme here. And, again, you talked about losing loved ones, and I'm very sorry for your loss. It's never easy to lose those that are close to you. But, from the very first origin with Lawrence following Val into the afterlife to, I mentioned the second volume where we're seeing others in family, and there's some Native North American tribes, some based in Canada as well, that have, very much a sense of family, of tribalism. And then in the third volume with another woman who loses a child, we see the sense of loss and how much can affect. And then obviously coming full circle with the Tether, or again, that idea of maturation and Val getting advice from his father, then going and getting advice from his grandfather. It's clearly something that really matters to you. And I think you bring a unique perspective, because not only does it matter to you, and the story is exploring that idea of family, but the fact that you create this book, with your children. So talk a little bit about the importance of that in the story, and what is it about family as an idea that you think is a really rich creative place to sort of play in?
Well, I mean, it's nice to hear that what you're saying about the connection with family, because it's certainly there. I'd like to say a couple things about that and then try to answer that question.
Yeah, sure.
The first thing I think I would say is that having my father be a character in the book has been incredibly healing. It has probably been the most definitively healing thing for me in terms of coping with his loss, because in a very real way, I hear my dad's voice in that character, and he's present in that character in some kind of amazing way. I don't fully know how to explain that, how that's possible, but I'll say that. And then the other thing I would say, kind of setting up the whole thing with family, is it's more of a family thing than you even recognize. Berto and my daughter, Lexi, who's a character, is a character. She's a cartoon character anyway in real life, but she helped me work on volume 3, in particular the story The Pit. But in addition to that, my wife has been a huge force in this book, because, and this will make some sense to you once you think about what the topic of volume 2 is. My wife is a specialist. She works for the VA, and she's a specialist in PTSD counseling and therapy. So, this idea of dealing with trauma, and most in particular, healing from trauma, is a topic that gets addressed almost every day in my household. So my wife is a major factor in the storytelling in terms of how these things get addressed. The sense that there's a generational quality to trauma, that it impacts entire families, that the past can live on in the present and manifest itself in different ways. So that those are some things to be aware of with the family. Now, as for the family, the role of family in the series, I would say that one of the things that I've come to learn in my own life, and I offer for whatever wisdom it might be for others, is that I've learned that family is a choice. And that not only can your family that you share blood be family, but anybody that you choose to embrace, that you choose to accept into your life, and to promise to be there for them as they are for you, that they can become family. And I hope I've shown that in these stories, in particular that volume 3, The Valentine. Yeah. The Valentine is really all about building a new family in the face of loss. Sharing the grief with other people. In a lot of ways, that theme of sharing grief, finding help to carry the grief, is a kind of a theme that runs through the series. But we find that in these stories, that as we reach out to people, as we are there for them in their moments of need, that our family grows, that the relationships that we have grow. And we see that with the characters of Val and Lawrence, particularly in these stories, where their relationships and their sense of family grows. And what we'll see, like if, I don't want to jump the gun too much, but volume 5 is already written. And we see in volume 5 a reappearance of a character from before, who comes and is in need of help. And our team kind of goes to his aid, and that becomes the basis for the jump off point for that volume's adventure. So I guess I hope that answers the question, is to say that I do feel like the themes of family are really, really important, but what makes up the family is something that I'm trying to raise that question, and to help people recognize that family is something that you choose and that you can build.
Yeah, oh yeah, I 100% agree. Sometimes the people that are your blood relation doesn't necessarily, theoretically, yes, they're your family, but not always. It's more like, those are my, genetically who I'm related to, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're your family. because I think family is a choice. But anything to add to that, Roberto, in terms of family as a theme throughout The Shepherd?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what got the ball rolling right at the beginning, is the bond between father and son. Like, if you don't have that kind of strong feeling for the other person, if you don't care that much, you're not going to make those choices. Yeah. And like, sometimes you're not going to make smart choices because, you know, you're a little bit emotionally compromised because you care about people. That happens.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, which is how this thing all got started, really. Well, we heard you say, Andrea, about your wife and what she's brought to the story in terms of trauma. Obviously, you know, the theme of family, and you're creating this with your family. The other couple things that I want to mention, certainly ideas of religion and what have you, more so in Volume 1 than in any of the others, but also a sense of history, which we get a lot of in Volume 2, with sort of some real-world events and some historical figures in a way. So can you talk about wanting to bring that to the story? Because I think that those are ideas that people can latch onto as well. And the other part of it is they're ideas that can be introduced to people that aren't necessarily familiar with those things, that then can lead them down paths of reading other materials and what have you to kind of enrich the experience.
Well, I think, first of all, the series, whenever I pitch the series, I always say that the series is about ghost stories, okay, that we tell ghost stories. And in particular, I've always been fascinated with ghost stories that involve a reason for the ghost to be haunting a particular place. You know, like, I'm a big fan of Guillermo del Toro's work, particularly his The Devil's Backbone, The Orphanage, which is, you know, titles like that. You know, so that's a big factor. With regard to the history that we use, not in all the volumes, but in a number of the volumes, certainly Volume 2 is very strong with history. And I would say that Volume 5, which you haven't read yet, we can arrange for that, by the way, it's done. Volume 5 is heavily historically grounded. And the reason for that is that when we talk about horror, because remember, ghost stories are a subgenre of horror, okay? I'm a big proponent of the fact that you don't have to make up ghost stories, that there are plenty of horrific things that humanity has done to itself, and, you know, that we could couch the story within that event or series of events. And that's what we tried to do, particularly in Volume 2 and then also in Volume 5, where we take actual historical events and then we take a fictional person that might have lived, but is a fictional person, and insert them into those circumstances, those exact historical circumstances, and see how they would respond, you know. So I think that that's where the history becomes, you know, a big factor. Certainly the religion is a big part of it, not just in Volume 1, but certainly in Volume 2, like the subtitle of Volume 2 or the title of Volume 2 is The Path of Souls. And the Path of Souls is actually the Wendat. The white men called them Huron. As you said, you're in Canada. The Wendat referred, when they looked at the Milky Way, they saw that that's where the souls would take that path and go to what they call the village, which is, you could think of it as their equivalent of heaven. Mm-hmm. And so their religious beliefs are certainly reflected. Other religious beliefs are reflected. I mean, there's a short story in Volume 1 that deals with the Egyptian judgment of the soul. So yeah, it's definitely part of it. It reflects my background. I have a doctorate in theology. My specialty is ancient Christian literature, but particularly folklore literature of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. But in addition to that, I was reading tons of just literature, mythology from the Mediterranean basin, Egyptian, Sumerian, Babylonian, Canaanite, Greek, Roman, Carthaginian, that type of thing. So I've always been fascinated with that. And so the history and the religion they kind of get, mixed into the soup, so to speak. And of course, it's taking place in the afterlife, so it's begging for it, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But don't worry, everybody, if you're out there listening going, man, I don't want to read anything about history or religion or whatever. Man, on the surface, again, relatable themes, ghost stories, fantastic art, spooky and fun, and lots of action. And whenever Val turns into the wolf form, the Legio, he looks just awesome. So, well, it's been great chatting with you guys. Really appreciate the time. Do we have any idea when Volume 5, because the first 4 volumes, they're out, everybody, they're available, but any timeline for Volume 5 when we should be on the lookout for it?
Well, it's going to go one of two ways. Right now we're with Scout. We're waiting to see, it's supposed to be published this fall. But they're waiting for major investment to come in, and that all publication is really kind of hinging on that. So we're kind of waiting to see how that's going to develop. But hopefully this fall, if not, maybe in the early spring. But it's all ready to go. I mean, the whole thing, it's a 4-issue series. It's good to go. And we're working on Volume 6 already, which I'm really excited about.
Great.
And that one also was influenced by history, by the way, too. So.
Well, if people want to follow along so they know when that's coming out, or they have questions about the series, or if they want to give their thoughts after they've had a chance to check it out, are you active online, on social media? Is there a place people can go to follow you to?
It's The Shepherd Comic at Instagram, Facebook are the two that we've used mostly. We are getting ready as of tomorrow, so it'll be October 1st. We're going to be launching our second major Kickstarter, and that's to help fund the printing of. We want to do a hardcover, ideally, but we'll, if we raise enough for the paperback, we'll do a paperback trade. But the idea is to do the hardcover if possible, and do that of Volume 4, which we're really excited about. And I'm real proud of Berto, his work on that novel, because. I think he did a really good job. And like he said, that short story that he wrote, The Library, was amazing. When I read it the first time, I was like, this is the best thing you've ever written. We've got to use this somehow. I knew right away that we needed to use that somehow with The Shepherd, but it just took a while for us to figure out exactly how to do that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So everybody, I'll put links to the Facebook and the Instagram in the show notes, as well as a link to the Kickstarter. Go and check it out. If it's your thing, be sure to to become part of the Shepherd community and back it. Let's make sure we can get this thing over the finish line. And I'll also remind everybody, as I always do when we're talking about Kickstarters, is, hey, maybe this sounds awesome and you would love to read Volume 4, The Tether, but times are tight and you just can't swing it right now. We get it. We understand. It's out of your control. But the other way you can help out Andrea and Roberto is to let people know, whether they're comic lovers or people that love things like religion, history, ghost stories, or just amazing stories. Let them know about the Kickstarter. Let your fellow comic readers know about it. Let your local comic shop know about it, so that anybody that wants to and is able to join the campaign right now has the opportunity to do that. So I'll throw it over to you, Roberto. Any last thoughts as we're winding down here?
I don't have a whole lot of thoughts left in my head at this point in the night. But I want to thank you for taking us on the show. I had a really good time. And I would say that I definitely look forward to The Burning Maid, because in my opinion, that's my favorite of the series, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, and again, it my fault, everybody. We were supposed to do this earlier, and I had to push it later, so I appreciate you guys staying up late. What about you, Andrea? Any last thoughts?
I just appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about it. And I thank you for your kind words about the series. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really am. We worked really hard on it, and we enjoyed doing it. Love telling the stories. We've already got Volume 6 and the idea for Volume 7. So we'll see how far this goes. We appreciate people's support. It makes the difference. It really does. It's the encouragement that we need to keep going.
Yeah, it makes all the difference. And one last thought that I'll throw out there, everybody, is these are very immersive stories, and they're big stories, right? It's not like you're gonna spend your money and then you read it and it's done in 5 minutes. It's not. Those aren't not that type of a story. it's got a heft to it. It's got a weight to it. It's really immersive. And again, it's good storytelling. So highly encourage everybody to go and check it out. So gentlemen, best of luck with the Kickstarter campaign. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jace. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to everybody out there in the audience, whether you're checking us out on YouTube or listening to the audio-only feed, we appreciate you taking the time and joining us as always. And we'll talk to you on the next one.